He'd also been one of Karen's victims in his own way, trapped by circumstances beyond his control and threatened with consequences that would have hurt his entire family. His courage in finally coming forward had made it possible to expose the full extent of Karen's crimes and ensure that she would never be able to hurt anyone else in our community again. The final court hearing was everything I'd hoped for, and more. Karen appeared in the defendant's dock wearing an Orange County Jail jumpsuit. Instead of her usual designer outfits, her once perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The judge read through the charges with gravity: embezzlement in the first-degree, conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, witness intimidation, organized criminal activity, and multiple counts of property destruction. Karen's defense attorney could only argue for leniency based on her supposed lack of prior convictions and alleged cooperation with the investigation. The prosecution's case was devastating. Detective Rodriguez testified about Karen's systematic criminal enterprise operating under the cover of HOA business for nearly 5 years. Tyler took the stand and calmly detailed his role as Karen's reluctant enforcer, describing each act of vandalism and intimidation he'd carried out under her threats. Walter Grayson presented his meticulous financial documentation, walking the court through 5 years of embezzlement with charts and bank records that made Karen's theft impossible to deny. The most powerful testimony came from Karen's victims' neighbors who'd suffered years of harassment without understanding who was responsible. Maria Santos described finding her car vandalized after announcing her intention to run for the HOA board. The Henderson family testified about mysterious property damage that had cost them thousands of dollars. One by one, Karen's victims told their stories, painting a picture of a peaceful neighborhood systematically terrorized by someone supposed to be protecting community interests. When it came time for sentencing, the judge's words were firm and condemning. Mrs. Prescott, he said, looking directly at Karen, you have systematically abused a position of trust to enrich yourself at your neighbor's expense, while terrorizing anyone who questioned your methods. You have corrupted a young man who trusted you and destroyed the peace of an entire community. This court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $450,000. The financial breakdown was staggering: $8,500 for damage to my boat, $200,000 stolen from the HOA treasury over 5 years, $150,000 in property damage to neighbors' homes and vehicles, $91,500 in legal fees and penalties. Karen's criminal enterprise had cost our community nearly $500,000 in direct damages, not counting the psychological trauma that would take years to heal. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, I felt complex emotions: relief that this nightmare was over and justice had been served, satisfaction that Karen would spend years behind bars, but also sadness that it had taken so much pain and destruction to reach this resolution. Karen's victims had suffered in silence for years, and Tyler's life had been derailed by an adult who should have been guiding him toward better choices. The aftermath brought unexpected changes to Bayside Cove. The HOA was restructured with new leadership and transparent financial oversight. Sam Torres was elected as our new president, bringing her legal expertise and commitment to fairness. The community came together in ways that hadn't been possible during Karen's reign of terror that had divided neighbors and created an atmosphere of fear throughout our once peaceful neighborhood. My boat became a local landmark after trial coverage appeared in regional newspapers. Children would walk by with their parents and ask about the famous boat that helped expose the corrupt HOA president. I started giving informal tours to neighbors curious about naval history, sharing stories about my military service and the friends I'd lost. The vessel Karen had tried to destroy as an eyesore became a source of community pride and education. Tommy and Marcus would have been proud knowing their memorial was bringing people together and teaching young people about military sacrifice. The financial settlement allowed me to completely restore my boat to better condition than when I'd first bought her. I replaced all damaged equipment, upgraded navigation systems, and added safety features while maintaining her classic military appearance. The insurance settlement for my damaged business reputation covered all income I'd lost during Karen's harassment campaign, plus compensation for stress and professional damage. 6 months after Karen began serving her sentence, I organized a community barbecue on my restored boat to celebrate the return of peace to Bayside Cove. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak During Karen's oppressive reign, gathered on my deck sharing food and stories while watching Florida sunsets paint the sky in brilliant colors. Hector brought his legendary grilled fish. Walter entertained everyone with stories from his accounting days. Sam gave a moving speech about standing up to bullies and corruption. Tyler attended with his parents, and his personal apology to everyone he'd wronged was emotionally powerful. He'd received community service and probation, but more importantly, he'd learned lessons about integrity and protecting innocent people. His family's mortgage had been transferred to a legitimate bank, freeing them from Karen's manipulation and allowing Tyler to return to college with renewed purpose. The most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Henderson raised her glass in a toast to Nate's boat. She said, her voice carrying across the water, "And to the man who refused to let a bully destroy something precious, you showed us that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's easier to give up." The applause that followed felt like vindication for all the stress, legal fees, and sleepless nights I'd endured as the party wound down. I found myself alone on my boat's deck, looking out at the peaceful water and thinking about this incredible journey. 9 months ago, I'd been a quiet marine engineer, living peacefully with my memorial boat, and Karen had been the unchallenged queen of Bayside Cove. Tonight she was sleeping in a prison cell while I was surrounded by friends who'd learned the importance of standing together against injustice. Walter was the last to leave, lingering to share final wisdom. "You know, Nate," he said, looking up at my restored boat, "Karen thought she could break you by attacking something you loved. Instead, she gave you strength to expose her crimes and save our community. Sometimes the thing meant to destroy us becomes what makes us stronger." I watched Walter walk home and realized he was absolutely right about the profound irony of our situation. That night, I sat in my boat's pilot house, running my fingers over the gleaming controls and thinking about Tommy and Marcus. They died fighting enemies who used violence and intimidation, and I'd won my battle against someone who used lawsuits and harassment for similar ends. Different weapons, same basic evil: the desire to control and destroy others for personal gain. My boat had become more than a memorial. It had become a symbol of resistance against bullies and a reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender their principles. Comment below and let me know about any HOA horror stories you've experienced, because something tells me Karen's story isn't the only one out there, and who knows, maybe your drama could be the next incredible story I get to share with the practically bouncing with excitement. Hector grabbed my arm and said, "Nate, you've got to see this." He led me straight into his garage, where his elaborate security system was displayed across a wall of high-definition monitors. He pointed to one of the screens. His face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. There, in crystal-clear night vision footage, was none other than Karen Prescott herself, dressed head to toe in black like some kind of suburban ninja. The timestamp in the corner read 2:15 a.m., and the camera had captured her in the act. She was creeping around my boat with clear intent, pulling a can of spray paint from her jacket and vandalizing it like a delinquent teenager. She wasn't done there. With one wild swing, she smashed the navigation lights using a crowbar, and in her rush to escape, she dropped a pair of high-end gloves, probably thinking no one would be watching. Hector was practically trembling as he saved the footage onto multiple backup drives. "I've been waiting years for this," he grinned, eyes wide. "She's finally exposed herself. This woman has made life hell for half this neighborhood, and now we've got her, clear as day." But Karen wasn't ready to back down. Just 3 days after I'd sent her a calm, direct email about the gloves she left behind, I received a fresh notice from the HOA. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was a demand. A formal notice claiming I owed a $500 fine for allegedly violating community standards. This time, she cited a completely different section of the HOA bylaws, one written so vaguely that it could be interpreted 100 different ways. According to her twisted interpretation, I was now guilty of failing to maintain property in a manner conducive to neighborhood harmony. The rule didn't define what that meant, which meant Karen could apply it however she wanted. Too many leaves in your yard? You're guilty. Your fence is an inch too high? You're fined. In my case, the real violation was daring to call her out. Then came the real bombshell. A week later, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail, its return address from a company I'd never heard of, Precision Property Solutions. Inside was a newly commissioned property survey, allegedly showing that the land where my boat was docked wasn't mine after all. According to this revised document, my property ended 15 feet before the shoreline, which meant my boat was technically sitting on community land without permission. At first glance, it looked official. The formatting, the seals, the signature, it was all designed to pass inspection. But when I laid it side by side with the original survey from when I purchased the house, the fraud became crystal clear. Someone had literally moved the property line on paper, stealing 15 feet of my waterfront property in the process. It was a careful, sophisticated forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. I knew I needed help, fast. That's when I called Samantha Torres, a sharp 29-year-old legal aide at the city planning department. Sam had seen Karen in action before, at HOA meetings where Karen had embarrassed residents over the tiniest things, from wind chimes to the color of a front door. She had her own grudge against our power-hungry president. When I showed her both versions of the survey, her expression hardened. She laid them out on her desk, pointing to the subtle differences in font spacing, watermark placement, and line measurements. "This is a textbook case of forgery and fraud," she said, eyes narrowing. "Whoever did this committed multiple felonies. The real question is, can we prove Karen was behind it?" Sam agreed to help me dig deeper into Karen's past. We needed to know if this was a one-time offense or part of a larger pattern. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. She started what she called a beautification campaign, going door to door with a clipboard and a forced smile, asking neighbors to sign a petition demanding the removal of my unsightly vessel from what she now claimed was communal property. Her pitch was flawless. She told each person that my boat was single-handedly lowering their property values and that I was acting in open defiance of community standards. Some people signed out of fear. Others signed because they truly believed her lies. Karen had spent years cultivating a reputation as someone who could ruin your life if you stepped out of line. And now, people were siding with her out of self-preservation. The psychological toll on me was brutal. Neighbors who once greeted me with smiles and waves now looked away or crossed the street when they saw me coming. Conversation stopped when I entered a room and resumed in hushed tones once I passed. The isolation was crushing. But worse than that, my business began to suffer. 2 potential clients backed out of contracts after researching me and stumbling onto the HOA dispute. Karen was quietly assassinating my reputation and damaging my income, all while acting as though she had nothing to do with the vandalism or the forged documents. She was covering every angle, playing innocent in public while sabotaging me behind the scenes. But then, karma slipped up. One afternoon, as I walked past the community center, I spotted Karen in what she thought was a private conversation with a man in a tailored suit. They stood close, speaking in hushed tones, their body language betraying the secrecy of their exchange. When she saw me, her posture stiffened and she abruptly ended the conversation, walking away in a hurry. But not before I discreetly snapped a photo of the man on my phone. That night, I stared at the photo until it hit me. He was the same man who had signed the fraudulent property survey. Karen had made her first real mistake, meeting her accomplice in public. Fueled by adrenaline, I dove headfirst into research. I combed through public records, archived HOA meeting minutes, and even neighborhood forums looking for dirt. What I found was a goldmine. There were past complaints of Karen fining residents for rules that didn't exist, pushing through shady expenditures, and even misappropriating funds for personal use. 3 board members had resigned during her tenure, each citing hostile leadership or ethical concerns. One particularly damning email thread showed her clashing with the HOA's accountant over reimbursements for spa treatments and luxury restaurant bills, expenses she tried to pass off as community outreach. Everything was adding up. Karen wasn't just petty. She was methodically abusing her power, manipulating the bylaws, and steamrolling anyone who got in her way. But she had never dealt with someone like me. I had a military background. I understood patience, discipline, and above all, strategy. While Karen had relied on fear and manipulation, I was building a file, a bulletproof case, piece by piece. It was time to go on the offensive. That weekend, I worked nonstop, putting together a digital presentation that compiled every misdeed Karen had committed as HOA president. I included the video footage of her vandalizing my boat, side-by-side comparisons of the real and forged surveys, screenshots of the email thread about fraudulent reimbursements, and testimonies from neighbors she had bullied. I cross-referenced everything with timestamps, financial records, and HOA documentation. It was airtight. At 9 a.m. sharp on Monday morning, I uploaded the entire exposé to our neighborhood's online community forum. I titled it simply, "The Truth About Your HOA President, Video Evidence Inside." It all started with Hector's video, crystal clear footage showing Karen, caught red-handed, vandalizing my boat in the dead of night. Spray can in hand, expression twisted with malice. There was no mistaking who she was or what she was doing. The moment I posted that video online, the response was like lighting a match to gasoline. Within mere hours, the comments began pouring in, dozens, then hundreds, neighbors, friends, even former HOA members sharing their own stories. Stories that painted a picture of Karen as not just a petty rule enforcer, but a vindictive tyrant who had ruled our community with fear and favoritism for far too long. Margaret Chun recounted being fined $300 for planting roses that Karen claimed were the wrong shade of pink, despite them being identical to the ones in Karen's own front yard. Robert Williams revealed how he had been ordered to repaint his entire home because Karen insisted the original color didn't meet aesthetic standards, even though it was a match to several homes nearby. But the most disturbing testimony came from elderly Walter Grayson. With trembling hands, he brought forward documents, meticulous records, proving that Karen had been systematically targeting residents she didn't like with fabricated fines, nuisance complaints, and a campaign of harassment so relentless that some were ultimately pressured into selling their homes and leaving for good. Hector's video had become a turning point. For years, Karen had silenced the community with threats and bureaucracy. But now that her actions were visible and undeniable, others finally found the courage to speak up. And Karen's response? It wasn't remorse. It wasn't an apology. It was war. Instead of addressing the accusations or even attempting to defend herself, Karen went on the offensive. Viciously, she filed formal complaints with the county zoning board, falsely accusing me of operating an illegal marina out of my residential property. She even called the Coast Guard to report that my boat was improperly moored and posed a potential hazard to navigation. But she wasn't finished. Somehow, she managed to pull strings with a county inspector, likely one of her longtime allies, who issued a fraudulent environmental violation, claiming my boat was leaking fuel into the water. The accusation was outrageous. My boat hadn't been fueled in months, and anyone who walked past it could see the water was clean. But that didn't matter to Karen. The violation alone was enough to trigger the next stage of her plan. Using the inspector's bogus report, she filed an emergency injunction with the county court, demanding that my boat be impounded immediately for environmental remediation. She claimed that every additional day it remained in the water was a threat to marine life and public health. And like that, my boat, my sanctuary, my memorial to Tommy and Marcus, was suddenly at risk of being taken from me forever. I had less than a week to fight back. Karen had backed me into a legal and emotional corner. She thought I'd break. She counted on it. But what she didn't count on was just how far I'd go, or how many allies I now had standing with me. Sam Torres, my sharpest and most determined friend, worked tirelessly digging into legal databases and public records. She uncovered a damning pattern. The same inspector who filed the report against me had a history of shady deals, false citations, manipulated reports, and secretive payments. More shockingly, Sam discovered records showing that Karen's own husband, a local construction magnate, had paid that inspector for favorable evaluations on projects that clearly should have failed. It wasn't just dirty, it was criminal. Meanwhile, Hector took to the streets with his camera again, capturing fresh footage around the marina. He interviewed neighbors who confirmed they had never smelled fuel or seen any evidence of pollution near my dock. His footage told the real story: clean waters, a pristine shoreline, and a community united against lies. But the breakthrough came from a source I never expected: Tyler Prescott, Karen's own nephew, just 19, but visibly shaken in the days following the vandalism. I'd noticed him skulking around the marina, glancing over his shoulder like he was waiting to be caught. One night, Walter mentioned seeing someone Tyler's size near the dock when Karen struck. That's when it clicked. Tyler wasn't just nearby. He might have been her accomplice. I waited for the right moment. When I spotted him alone at the bait shop, I approached gently. "Hey, Tyler," I said, casual as I could be. "How's college treating you?" He turned pale instantly. His hands shook. He stammered some excuse about being busy, avoiding my eyes like they burned. When I offhandedly mentioned my boat had been vandalized and asked if he'd seen anything strange that night, his answer gave him away. "I don't know anything about your boat," he blurted. "I wasn't even there that night." But I hadn't told him which night. That slip told me everything. Still, I needed proof. That night, I returned to the marina with a metal detector and combed the area around my dock. After nearly 2 hours, I found it, partially buried in the sand beneath the planks, a small flashlight, engraved with the initials K. Prasad. Karen's full name. Red paint, the same color used in the vandalism, still clung to its surface. It was the smoking gun. And Tyler? He couldn't hold it in any longer. When I showed him the flashlight, his last bit of resistance crumbled. Through tears and terrified whispers, he confessed it all. Karen had coerced him into acting as her lookout that night. She promised to pay his tuition and threatened to pin the crime on him if he ever spoke. She dangled his future like a puppet string, and he'd been living in constant fear ever since. But now, guilt had overwhelmed fear. With Tyler's confession, the flashlight, Hector's footage, and Sam's legal research, we moved fast. We filed for an emergency hearing, just in time to intercept Karen's injunction. We had less than 48 hours to build a case that would not only save my boat, but shine a spotlight on Karen's reign of terror. This wasn't just about one boat anymore. It had become a fight for truth, justice, and the soul of our neighborhood. A test of whether powerful bullies like Karen could weaponize the law to crush ordinary people without consequence. But just when I thought I was ready, Karen hit back one final time. At 6 a.m. on the morning of the hearing, my phone lit up with angry messages and panicked voicemails from clients and friends in the boating industry. Someone, clearly Karen, had launched a digital smear campaign. Anonymous posts flooded forums and professional networks, accusing me of operating illegally as a marine contractor, claiming my licenses were revoked, and that I was under investigation for fraud. They even attached forged documents to make it look official. It was a last-ditch ambush meant to shatter my reputation and destroy my livelihood, just hours before I stepped into court. But Karen had made one fatal miscalculation. I wasn't alone anymore. And this time, we were ready. Different counties were now involved, and I'd just learned that I was under investigation by the state licensing board, accused of endangering public safety through incompetent work. It was a complete fabrication, but it had been strategically timed and expertly circulated. Every online forum, trade site, and social network where marine professionals gathered had been seeded with the story. It spread like wildfire, and within hours, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Clients demanded explanations I couldn't give. Contracts were canceled mid-process, emails went unanswered, and new prospects who had been close to signing deals pulled out without hesitation. One call in particular broke me. Peterson Marine, a prestigious yacht manufacturer I'd dreamed of working with for years, had just finalized plans to hire me for a $50,000 restoration project on a rare vintage racing yacht. The project manager's voice was calm but distant. "We can't risk our company's name being associated with someone under investigation," he said, regret heavy in his words. "I'm sure you understand our position." And I did. I understood it too well. Karen had aimed not just to discredit me, but to destroy me financially. She knew that strangling my livelihood would do far more damage than any legal maneuver. The forged documents that started the firestorm weren't just amateur fakes. They were disturbingly professional, painstakingly crafted to look official. Legitimate licensing board forms had been copied and manipulated with altered details about my company's certifications, painting me as a reckless, unlicensed contractor. The forger even created fictitious case numbers and referenced actual officials from the board, making the whole package seem authentic to anyone not familiar with the real documentation. This wasn't the work of a bitter neighbor playing dress-up as a legal expert. This was organized. Either Karen had learned forgery from a master, or she had hired one. And given her access to money, influence, and the shady network that came with running an HOA like a dictatorship, it wasn't hard to guess the truth. As I drove toward the courthouse that morning, the notifications kept pouring in: emails, voicemails, text messages. Every ping felt like another part of my career unraveling. I couldn't even respond fast enough to control the narrative. 15 years. I'd spent 15 years earning my reputation in the marine industry, and now it was being burned down by one malicious neighbor with a grudge and a Wi-Fi signal. Even if I proved my innocence and won my case about the boat, I might still lose the very thing that made all of it possible, my name. When I arrived at the courthouse, the scene was surreal. Karen strolled in like she was attending a red carpet fundraiser, draped in a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than some people's annual rent. She wasn't alone. She'd upgraded her legal team, too. Her new lawyer was a woman in her 50s, sharp-featured and steely-eyed. The kind who wins cases not with evidence, but intimidation and psychological warfare. Their strategy was clearly theatrical. They had blown up photos of my boat displayed on poster boards, with dramatic red arrows pointing to supposed environmental damage. They included testimony from carefully selected residents, people who'd either been misled, manipulated, or straight-up bribed, claiming they feared for their safety and property values because of my derelict vessel. But our defense wasn't built on drama. It was built on facts. Sam rolled out Hector's surveillance footage showing Karen trespassing on my dock, defacing the boat. Tyler's sworn statement placed her at the scene and outlined her entire plan. We had physical evidence, the engraved flashlight, the designer gloves, both linked directly to her. Neighbors provided statements confirming Karen had been lurking around late at night, contradicting her fabricated alibi. But the most damning piece came when we exposed the inspector who filed the false environmental violation report. We had financial records proving he'd been receiving payments through Karen's husband's construction company in exchange for favorable project approvals. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a personal attack. This was corruption. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a gaze sharp enough to cut steel, listened to everything with a calm, controlled demeanor. She didn't waste time with legal theatrics. She asked hard questions that pierced right through Karen's arguments. When Karen's lawyer claimed the boat posed an urgent environmental risk, the judge asked for independent contamination reports. None existed. When they argued my boat was moored illegally, she demanded proof from local maritime ordinances. The records confirmed I had followed every regulation to the letter. But then came the turning point. The judge quietly announced that new evidence had been submitted that very morning. It was a sworn affidavit from Tyler Prescott. Tyler's testimony turned everything upside down. He didn't just admit to helping Karen. He laid out a disturbing pattern of calculated harassment, how Karen had coerced him into helping her damage property, threaten residents, and create chaos for anyone who dared stand up to her rule. His statement contained dates, tactics, and names. This wasn't about one boat. This was about a woman who had built an empire of fear within Bayside Cove, ruling not through leadership, but through threats and manipulation. Karen's response sealed her fate. Instead of denying it calmly or attempting damage control, she snapped. She launched into a venomous tirade, calling Tyler a lying traitor, a worthless coward trying to save himself. She said he acted alone. Then, in the same breath, insisted my boat deserved it. That eyesore was dragging down the whole neighborhood, she screamed across the courtroom. And in that moment, any illusion of her being a concerned citizen melted away. Everyone saw her for what she truly was, a vindictive tyrant with a designer wardrobe. The judge's ruling came quickly. All of Karen's claims were dismissed. There was no evidence of contamination, no mooring violations, and no justification for the damage. She ordered Karen to pay full restitution for the repairs to my boat, my legal expenses, and all court costs. But it didn't stop there. The judge formally referred the case to the district attorney for criminal investigation into vandalism, document forgery, false reporting, and conspiracy. Karen left the courthouse that day in silence, no longer the smug queen of Bayside Cove. But as I walked out into the sunlight, the victory felt strangely hollow. My phone was still buzzing. Clients still wanted answers. Colleagues had heard the rumors and weren't waiting for legal verdicts. They were protecting their own reputations, just as Peterson Marine had. I had won in court, yes. But my business, my name, my livelihood, they were still bleeding. Karen had lost the battle, but the war she started wasn't over. I knew she had more cards to play. And now, so did I. The real question wasn't just about whether I could prove Karen wrong. It was about whether I had the strength, the endurance, and the resources to survive whatever twisted scheme she'd come up with next. In the weeks following the court hearing, my life settled into a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. On one hand, I'd won a huge battle. I'd successfully defended my boat, exposed Karen's involvement in the vandalism, and walked out of that courtroom with the law on my side. But victory didn't come with peace. Instead, it came with whispers, doubts, and a cloud still hanging over my name. Despite the court ruling and even local news stories clearing my name, my reputation within the marine community was still severely damaged. The fake licensing scandal Karen had orchestrated had gone viral within industry circles. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Clients, suppliers, certification agencies, all calling not to offer support, but to verify if I was the fraud people claimed I was. And even though I had stacks of documentation proving every credential was legitimate, it didn't matter. I was spending all my time defending my name, not doing the work I actually loved. It felt like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship using nothing but my bare hands. Meanwhile, Karen had disappeared from the spotlight. After her courtroom embarrassment, she canceled all HOA meetings, stopped her power walks, and essentially vanished from the neighborhood's day-to-day life. But I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't someone who gave up. She was someone who regrouped. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. Word trickled through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd hired a private investigator, someone tasked with tearing apart my past, searching for anything she could spin into a scandal. She even went as far as contacting some of my former Navy brothers, fishing for dirt. I knew this wasn't about justice for her. It was about revenge. Karen was relentless, methodical, and dangerous in the way that only someone obsessed with control can be. But help came from the most unlikely place. One quiet evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, there stood Walter Grayson, an unassuming 70-year-old retiree known more for feeding stray cats than anything else. In his hands was a thick manila folder. "I've been saving these for the right moment," he said, eyes twinkling like he was about to perform a magic trick. Walter, it turned out, was a retired accountant with an eagle eye for numbers and a grudge against corruption. And over the past 5 years, he had been documenting everything Karen had done, quietly, meticulously, like a forensic historian of neighborhood wrongdoing. What he laid out on my kitchen table was jaw-dropping. Walter had uncovered a massive embezzlement scheme. Karen had been siphoning off HOA funds for personal use in a way so blatant it was almost surreal. She was using HOA credit cards to pay for personal indulgences, spa treatments, shopping sprees, 5-star vacations, even tennis lessons at the country club. She disguised personal renovations as community projects, billing the association for landscaping, pool cleaning, and even a brand new roof on her house. She'd been writing herself checks under vague categories like administrative services, without board approval or disclosure. And the total amount? Over $200,000. That was money meant for fixing potholes, updating infrastructure, maintaining shared amenities. Instead, it had gone into Karen's designer handbags and luxury getaway weekends. Walter had everything: bank records, receipts, canceled checks, credit card statements, and perhaps most damning of all, meeting minutes showing that Karen had repeatedly blocked proposals to conduct independent financial audits. No wonder. But the real smoking gun came in the form of intercepted emails between Karen and her thug-in-chief, Tyler. In these messages, she gave explicit instructions for vandalizing my boat, right down to the tools to use and where to hit for the most emotional damage. It was like reading a military op plan, coldly calculated and staggeringly cruel. Worse yet, the emails revealed that I wasn't the only target. Karen had also been plotting similar acts of harassment against other residents who had dared to speak up against her, using Tyler as her personal enforcer to carry out a reign of quiet terror. Armed with Walter's damning dossier, Sam Torres and I reached out to Detective Rodriguez, the officer originally assigned to investigate the vandalism. A 15-year veteran specializing in white-collar crime, Rodriguez didn't even blink after reading Walter's documents. "This isn't HOA drama," she said, scanning the evidence with a practiced eye. "This is felony-level embezzlement, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering." She immediately opened a broader criminal case and assured us that once the Financial Crimes Unit completed their verification and obtained the necessary warrants, Karen would be arrested within days. The case was airtight, and the district attorney was going to love it. As we sat there with Rodriguez, watching her carefully document every single piece of evidence, the weight of the moment hit me. Karen's downfall wasn't going to come from her attack on my boat. It was going to come from her arrogance, from believing she was untouchable, from ignoring the quiet old man down the street who saw everything and never forgot a number. Walter, the retired accountant she once mocked, had just orchestrated her undoing. She was going to lose everything: her reputation, her home, her freedom, because she couldn't resist feeding her ego and her wallet at the expense of the very people she was supposed to serve. As I prepared myself for what came next, press, legal proceedings, public fallout, I took a moment to breathe. 6 months ago, I was just a quiet marine engineer. I wanted nothing more than to work on my boat, honor my fallen friends, and be left alone. But Karen had turned my life upside down. And in fighting back, I had stumbled into a much deeper rot. My boat, the tribute to Tommy and Marcus that she tried to destroy, had become something greater. It became the spark that lit up years of corruption and exposed a predator hiding behind HOA bylaws and fake smiles. Her greed and malice had affected dozens of families, people who now would finally see justice. The morning of her arrest was strangely peaceful. I sat on my boat's deck with a cup of coffee, the lake quiet, the sunrise casting gold across the water. It was the kind of moment Tommy and Marcus would have loved. The irony was beautiful. Karen had tried to tear me down over that boat, but it was that very boat that brought her down. A memorial became a weapon. A tribute turned into a reckoning. And as the police pulled into her driveway, I knew she never stood a chance. Not against truth, not against a community waking up, and not against a man trained never to surrender. Tyler would still face legal consequences for his actions. But as I looked at him, this trembling, exhausted young man unraveling years of fear and secrets, I realized that his path to redemption had already begun. The weight he'd been carrying was unimaginable, and for the first time in what must have felt like forever, he had finally laid it down. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it poured out of him in raw, unfiltered waves, and I could see the pain of every terrible thing he had been coerced into doing. He wasn't proud of it. In fact, his voice cracked when he recalled certain memories, like slashing the Hendersons' tires or dumping garbage on Maria's lawn. I hated myself more every time, he admitted, eyes fixed on the floor, as if afraid to see the judgment in mine. But there was no judgment, just the quiet understanding that sometimes people get caught in webs far bigger than themselves, and escaping takes more courage than most people ever summon. Tyler's confession was more than just a list of misdeeds. It was the final unraveling of Karen's empire, thread by thread. He talked about how she manipulated everyone around her, how she used charm and fake concern like tools in a toolbox, how she'd smile to your face and plan your downfall behind closed doors. Karen hadn't just been running a corrupt HOA. She'd been orchestrating a reign of psychological terror, quietly destroying the lives of those who dared question her self-appointed rule. It wasn't just about power for her. It was control, domination, the perverse satisfaction of watching others squirm under her influence. And yet, despite all her cunning, she'd made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the strength of those she had tried to silence, and she never imagined that someone like Tyler, someone she viewed as a pawn, would be the one to bring her empire crumbling down. As the news spread, the entire community was shaken to its core. The tennis moms at the country club, the retirees who once nodded politely at Karen during HOA meetings, even the landscapers who trimmed her hedges with robotic precision. Everyone now looked at her estate not as the center of community pride, but as the dark castle where countless acts of cruelty had been plotted. The arrest photos were plastered across social media, accompanied by hashtags that once praised her involvement but now mocked her downfall. And the forum threads exploded, neighbors sharing stories that no longer felt like isolated incidents, but pieces of a much larger puzzle. Now it all makes sense, one post read. I thought my kid was targeted at school for no reason. Turns out Karen had talked to the principal. Another neighbor shared how their family had once considered moving because they felt so unwelcome, only to learn they were one of Karen's many targets. But for me, the most surreal moment came not with her arrest or Tyler's confession, but with what came afterward, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. No more anonymous complaints, no more veiled threats, no more passive-aggressive notes taped to my door. For the first time since I moved into Bayside Cove, I could breathe. The tension that had blanketed this community like a fog was finally lifting. People began greeting each other again. Real conversations happened at the mailbox, and even Walter, who usually kept to himself, organized a neighborhood barbecue. It was as if a curse had been lifted, and everyone was slowly remembering what it felt like to live without fear. Tyler's testimony not only dismantled Karen's grip on our lives, but sparked something far greater, a movement. Detective Rodriguez shared that other neighborhoods had begun reaching out, reporting eerily similar patterns of abuse from different HOA leaders emboldened by power and unchecked authority. What happened in Bayside Cove wasn't just the fall of a tyrant. It was a warning shot to every Karen in every gated community who thought they were untouchable. The legal system had taken notice, and reforms were on the horizon. Transparency laws, limits on HOA authority, even criminal background checks for board members. Those conversations were no longer whispers. They were headlines. As for Karen, she sat in a county holding cell awaiting a trial that would likely become one of the most watched court cases in the state. Gone were her designer tennis skirts, her smug smile, and the aura of invincibility she once wore like a crown. In their place stood a woman stripped of power, reputation shattered, legacy burned to ash by her own greed and arrogance. And while justice was still unfolding, one truth was undeniable. She would never again rule Bayside Cove. Her reign was over. And in the ashes of everything she built through manipulation and fear, something better was already beginning to grow. He had been one of Karen's victims too, though in a way most people didn't see at first. He wasn't just a bystander. He was trapped, coerced by circumstances that spiraled beyond his control. Karen had dangled threats over his head like a blade, making it clear that if he didn't comply, the consequences wouldn't just hit him, they'd devastate his entire family. It was only when he found the courage to speak out, despite that fear, that the full depth of Karen's cruelty began to come to light. His testimony broke the dam wide open, giving us the final push we needed to expose the truth and make sure that no one else would ever be hurt by her schemes again. The final court hearing felt like the culmination of a long, painful journey, one filled with sleepless nights, anxiety, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Karen stood in the defendant's box, not in one of her pristine designer suits, but in a standard-issue Orange County Jail jumpsuit. Her perfectly coiffed hair had been reduced to a plain ponytail. The woman who had once walked through our community with haughty pride now looked like someone clinging to whatever dignity she had left. The courtroom was silent as the judge listed her charges: first-degree embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, witness intimidation, organized criminal activity, and multiple counts of property destruction. Her defense attorney made a weak appeal for leniency, citing her clean criminal record and supposed cooperation, but no one in the room was moved. The prosecution delivered blow after blow. Detective Rodriguez laid out how Karen had manipulated her position of authority within the HOA to build a criminal empire right under everyone's noses, hiding her actions in plain sight for almost half a decade. Tyler stepped up to the stand, calm but visibly emotional, and detailed how Karen had made him her enforcer through threats and psychological control. He admitted to every act of vandalism and intimidation she'd ordered, his voice steady as he took responsibility, but his pain was evident. Then came Walter Grayson, who had painstakingly pieced together a financial timeline that left no room for denial. With clear charts, bank records, and transaction histories, he walked the courtroom through 5 years of theft that bled the community dry. But it was the neighbors, the victims, whose testimonies brought tears to people's eyes. Maria Santos described how her car was vandalized the day after she announced plans to run for the board. The Hendersons recalled unexplained property damage that cost them thousands over the years. Story by story, the courtroom saw the full picture. A neighborhood tormented by someone who was supposed to protect it, all in the name of greed and power. When sentencing came, the courtroom held its breath. The judge didn't mince words. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, locking eyes with Karen, "you have systematically abused a position of trust. You enriched yourself at the expense of your neighbors. You intimidated anyone who questioned you. You corrupted a young man who trusted you and destroyed the peace of this community. You will serve 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Furthermore, You are ordered to pay full restitution, $450,000. The breakdown was brutal. $8,500 for the damage to my boat, $200,000 stolen from the HOA over 5 years, $150,000 in neighbor property damage, and $91,500 in legal fees and penalties. The numbers were staggering, but the emotional cost went beyond any dollar amount. Karen had caused long-term psychological damage, anxiety, distrust, broken friendships. As she was escorted out in handcuffs, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that it was finally over, satisfaction that justice had been served, but also a heavy sadness for what we'd all endured. Tyler's youth had been manipulated. Our neighbors had been terrorized. And all of it for what? Greed and ego. But from the wreckage, something unexpected began to bloom. The HOA was completely restructured. We held new elections, and Sam Torres, a woman with a law background and a strong sense of justice, was unanimously voted in as president. Under her leadership, we implemented financial transparency, quarterly audits, and community-driven improvement plans. Gone were the secret meetings and shady fees. Our neighborhood, once divided by fear, began to reconnect. I watched neighbors who hadn't spoken in years strike up conversations at community events. Kids played freely outside again. The darkness that had hovered over Bayside Cove started to lift. My boat, the very symbol Karen had tried to erase from our shoreline, became something else entirely. After the media covered the trial, it became a quiet landmark. Families walking by would stop, point it out to their children, and share pieces of the story. I started hosting informal tours, talking about the ship's history, my years of service, and the friends I'd lost. That boat had been built to honor Tommy and Marcus, and now it stood as a reminder of strength, unity, and resilience. The financial restitution allowed me to restore the vessel completely. I replaced every piece of damaged gear, upgraded the systems, and made her safer than ever while preserving her classic military character. The insurance company also settled for the damage Karen's campaign had done to my reputation and business. I received enough to cover lost income and additional damages, giving me the freedom to focus on community rebuilding. 6 months into Karen's sentence, I hosted a barbecue on the boat's deck. It was a celebration, not just of her departure, but of our collective survival. The laughter of children rang across the water. Hector grilled his legendary fish, Sam gave a rousing speech about standing up to corruption, and Tyler, now on the road to redemption, apologized in front of everyone. His sincerity was undeniable. His family's mortgage had been transferred to a legitimate bank, freeing them from Karen's grip. He was back in school, studying criminal justice, hoping to use his story to help others. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft orange and lavender hues, Mrs. Henderson raised a glass. "To Nate's boat," she said, her voice steady and proud. "And to the man who refused to let a bully destroy something precious. You showed us that sometimes doing the hard thing is the right thing." The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for all of us. For every battle fought in silence. For every tear shed. For every neighbor who had finally found their voice. Later that night, I stood alone on the deck, staring out across the still water. The boat's controls gleamed under the deck lights, and I found myself running my hand across them, thinking of Tommy and Marcus. They had fought enemies in war zones, people who used weapons and force to control others. Karen had used lawsuits, manipulation, and fear. But at their core, both were the same kind of enemy, those who seek to dominate, to steal peace from others for personal gain. And yet, we had won, not with violence, but with unity, truth, and the refusal to back down. My boat had become more than a tribute. It was now a beacon, a monument to what happens when good people decide they've had enough. A reminder that justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we fight for, even when the odds are against us. If you've ever experienced something like this, if you've faced an HOA horror story of your own, I want to hear it. Because trust me, Karen isn't the only one out there. And maybe, just maybe, your story is the next one I'll get to tell.